Unseen Revenge. Martin stood in the sprawling backyard of his sister's estate, the golden sun beginning to set behind the dense cluster of trees that lined the property. The air was filled with the fragrance of blooming roses, meticulously cared for by the estate gardeners. Yet, amidst all this beauty, Martin's mind was far from serene. He had one goal in mind, and for now, all his attention was focused on the towering Doberman sitting obediently in front of him. "Good boy, Zeus," Martin cooed, his voice dripping with feigned affection. He scratched behind the dog's ears, causing the Doberman's eyes to close in contentment. The massive dog, with its glossy black coat and muscular build, was a picture of power and grace. Zeus weighed nearly 80 kilos, yet under Martin's gentle touch, he was as docile as a lapdog. Martin's smile was warm, almost loving, as he leaned closer, whispering, "Will you do one more thing for me, boy? Will you honor your master for me?" Zeus tilted his head as if trying to understand Martin's soft words, his tongue lolling out as he panted happily. But while the dog basked in Martin's attention, there was darkness brewing beneath that facade of tenderness. Martin's smile was only skin-deep. Behind his calm exterior lurked a festering resentment. In truth, Martin despised Ben Thompson, his brother-in-law, with every fiber of his being. The hatred ran deep, like a wound that had never fully healed. And every time Martin looked at Zeus, he saw a symbol of everything he had lost because of Ben. The story of Martin's hatred began a year ago. Before Ben entered the picture, Martin had been living the high life, managing his sister Lydia's vast estate, and enjoying the hefty income that came with it. Lydia, his younger sister, had been widowed young but inherited her late husband's substantial fortune. She was a beautiful, soft-hearted woman who trusted her brother completely. In those carefree days, Martin had full control over her wealth, managing the estate's business affairs. For 2 blissful years, he lived like a king, driving luxury cars, throwing lavish parties, and pocketing a considerable sum for himself. But then, Lydia had met Ben Thompson. Ben was everything Martin wasn't. A charismatic accountant with a sharp mind and a reputation for honesty, Ben had swept Lydia off her feet in no time. They had met at a charity gala, where Ben had caught her attention with his charm and wit. Within months, the two were inseparable, and before Martin could react, they were married in a quiet ceremony. Martin's life had been turned upside down. As Lydia's husband, Ben naturally took over the management of her finances, gently but firmly edging Martin out of the picture. With Ben's expertise, Lydia's business affairs were quickly put in order, leaving no room for Martin's under-the-table dealings. Martin's access to easy money dried up almost overnight. He was no longer the king of the castle, but rather a mere guest, tolerated only because he was Lydia's brother. As Martin's resentment grew, so did his hatred for Ben. To make matters worse, Ben had brought Zeus into the family. The massive Doberman had been a gift to Lydia, a symbol of Ben's protective nature. The dog adored Ben and was fiercely loyal to him. Watching Lydia laugh as Zeus bounded around the garden, or seeing the dog sit obediently by Ben's side, had become a constant reminder to Martin of everything he had lost. But Martin was nothing if not patient. He knew better than to show his hand too early. Instead, he played his part, smiling and acting like the supportive brother, while secretly plotting how he could reclaim his former life. In the past few weeks, he had begun to focus on Zeus, using every opportunity to bond with the dog. "You're such a good boy, aren't you, Zeus?" Martin whispered, his voice smooth as honey. "You love Ben, don't you? But you'd do anything for me, too, wouldn't you?" He continued to stroke the dog's sleek fur, his fingers moving in slow, circular motions. Zeus responded with a soft whimper of pleasure, nuzzling Martin's hand. "Ah, yes, good boy," Martin muttered, a wicked glint in his eyes as he continued to pet the Doberman. "You trust me, don't you, Zeus? But soon, you'll be doing something very special for me, something that your beloved master will never see coming." At that moment, Lydia's voice echoed from the patio. "Martin, are you out there?" she called, her tone cheerful. Quickly adjusting his expression, Martin smiled broadly and called back, "Yes, Lydia. Just spending some time with Zeus." She appeared a moment later, her face lighting up as she saw her brother crouched next to the dog. "He really seems to like you," she said, beaming with pride. "Ben always says Zeus has a great sense for people. He only trusts the kind-hearted." Martin's smile widened, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "I'm honored," he replied smoothly. "Zeus is truly one of a kind." As Lydia returned to the house, Martin's smile faded, replaced by a cold, calculating look. "Yes, my dear sister," he whispered under his breath, watching her retreating figure. "Zeus trusts me, and that will be Ben's downfall." Martin stood up and gave the dog one last pat on the head. "Come on, boy," he said, his voice low. "You and I are going to change things around here. I promise." Zeus wagged his tail, oblivious to the sinister thoughts racing through Martin's mind. To the dog, Martin was a friend, but Martin had already begun to lay the groundwork for his plan, a plan that would rid him of Ben Thompson for good and return him to the life of luxury he craved. As the last rays of the sun dipped below the horizon, Martin's eyes gleamed with determination. The time was fast approaching, and soon his carefully crafted scheme would be set into motion. For now, he played the part of the loving brother and the doting uncle to the dog, all the while hiding the darkness that lay beneath his charming smile. The grand manor of the Whitlock estate stood like a silent sentinel on the outskirts of the city. Its tall, wrought-iron gates and immaculately manicured lawns whispered of old money and power. Inside, the lavishly decorated rooms gleamed with polished mahogany and gilded chandeliers, a reflection of the vast wealth that had fallen into Elena's lap after the untimely death of her husband, William Whitlock. But unbeknownst to Elena, her luxurious life had become the perfect playground for her brother Martin. Martin had always been the charming sibling, the kind who knew exactly what to say and how to say it. In times of tragedy, he was the one to console others, a reassuring presence in dark times. So, when William passed away suddenly, leaving Elena heartbroken and overwhelmed with the responsibility of managing his fortune, Martin was quick to step in. "I'll handle everything, Elena," Martin had said softly, his voice dripping with sincerity. He'd held her hand, his eyes filled with concern. "You just focus on taking care of yourself. Let me deal with the numbers, the paperwork, the lawyers, all of it. You know I only want what's best for you." Elena, fragile and grieving, had gratefully leaned on Martin's support. "I don't know how I'd manage without you," she whispered, her eyes brimming with tears. "William always handled all our finances. I feel so lost." "There's no need to worry about any of that," Martin had assured her, gently squeezing her hand. "You trust me, don't you?" And trust him she did. Elena, naive in the ways of business, had handed over the reins of her inheritance without a second thought. In those early days, her trust was a balm to Martin's ego. He'd always been the second fiddle in their family, living in the shadow of his more successful and beloved sister. But now, with her wealth under his control, Martin had finally found a way to step into the limelight. For the first few months, Martin played the dutiful brother, diligently sending Elena updates that were carefully crafted to seem transparent and honest. He would sit with her over breakfast in the sun-drenched conservatory, laying out documents and explaining the intricacies of her finances in a way that sounded both complex and boring enough to dissuade her from asking too many questions. "Elena, the market's been unpredictable lately," Martin would say, gesturing to a stack of papers filled with charts and figures. "But I've managed to reinvest some of your assets into safer options. You're in good hands, I promise." Elena would nod, her eyes glazing over as Martin spoke in financial jargon that went right over her head. "Thank you, Martin. I don't know what I'd do without you." "Oh, it's nothing," Martin would reply with a disarming smile. "I just want to see you happy." But behind those sweet words and warm smiles, Martin's true nature was anything but benevolent. The truth was, Martin had been siphoning off a significant portion of Elena's inheritance from the very beginning. He'd started small, skimming off just enough that it wouldn't be noticed in the mountain of transactions that came with managing such a vast fortune. But as the months turned into years, his appetite for more grew insatiable. Late at night, while Elena slept soundly in her luxurious bed, Martin would pour himself a glass of whiskey and retreat to the estate's grand study. The room, lined with leather-bound books and decorated with priceless antiques, was where he felt most in control. He would sit at the massive oak desk, his fingers flying over the keyboard as he transferred funds into accounts Elena would never know existed. Another day, another dollar, Martin would mutter to himself with a smirk, watching the digits on his screen climb higher and higher. He knew it was wrong, but to him, it felt like poetic justice. After all, hadn't he been overlooked and underappreciated all his life? This was merely compensation for years of playing second fiddle. He was careful, of course. Every withdrawal was masked under the guise of estate expenses or cleverly worded investments. And if Elena ever questioned a dip in her accounts, Martin would shrug it off with a smile. Markets fluctuate, dear sister. It's all part of the game. But Elena rarely questioned him. In her eyes, Martin was her rock, the only family she could trust. And Martin was skilled at playing on her emotions, keeping her wrapped around his little finger. One evening, as they sat in the drawing room, sipping tea in the flickering light of the fireplace, Elena hesitantly brought up a concern. "Martin, I've been noticing that some of the investments haven't yielded as much as you initially projected. Should I be worried?" Martin leaned back in his chair, his expression one of exaggerated patience. "Elena, you have to understand, these things take time. You're still making more than you ever would with a simple savings account. Trust me, I've got it all under control. But are you sure?" Elena asked, her brows furrowed in uncertainty. "Elena," Martin interrupted, leaning forward with an earnest look, "I'm your brother. I would never steer you wrong. Everything I do is for you." Elena's shoulders relaxed, and she gave him a small, grateful smile. "I know, Martin. I'm so grateful to have you." "Of course you are," Martin thought to himself, hiding a sly grin behind his teacup. "And that's exactly how I intend to keep it." The manipulation was an art form, one that Martin had perfected over the years. Every so often, he would treat Elena to an extravagant gift, a diamond necklace, a weekend getaway at an exclusive resort. Just a little token of appreciation, he'd say, knowing full well that these gestures would keep her questions at bay. Little did Elena know that these gifts were bought with her own money, the funds Martin had siphoned off from her accounts. But in her eyes, her brother was her savior, the one person who stood by her when the world had crumbled around her. As the second year drew to a close, Martin had amassed a small fortune for himself, hidden away in offshore accounts under false names. But his greed was far from sated. In his mind, the estate was his to control, his to plunder, and no one, not even his beloved sister, would stand in his way. Little did he know, however, that his carefully constructed web of lies was beginning to fray at the edges. The trouble began the moment Ben Thompson entered the picture. The Whitlock estate, once a serene refuge from Martin's machinations, was now under the scrutiny of a new, sharp pair of eyes. Elena had met Ben at a charity gala, one of those glitzy events where everyone wore their best smiles and even better lies. It was a whirlwind romance. Within 3 months, they were married. The wedding was a grand affair, the kind that made the society columns the next day. But while Elena beamed beside her new husband, Martin stood in the shadows, sipping champagne. His eyes narrowed as he watched Ben. Martin knew the type. The too-perfect smile, the sharp wit, the subtle way Ben had charmed his way into Elena's life. And now, he had access to her fortune, the very treasure trove Martin had been siphoning from for years. Martin's fears were confirmed when Elena casually mentioned that Ben was helping her organize her finances. "Ben's got such a knack for these things," she said one evening, her voice filled with newfound excitement. He's already found a few discrepancies in some old accounts. Martin's heart skipped a beat, though his face remained a mask of indifference. Oh, that's interesting, he said, taking a measured sip of his scotch to hide his anxiety. What kind of discrepancies? Just some odd transfers and expenses William had left behind. Elena explained, waving it off as if it were nothing. You know how chaotic everything was after his death. Ben's just being thorough. Thorough indeed, Martin thought bitterly. He knew exactly what those odd transfers were. They weren't William's doing. They were his. For years, he'd operated in the shadows, taking small but regular slices of Elena's inheritance. But now, with Ben's meticulous eyes poring over the books, Martin's game was in jeopardy. The next time Martin visited the estate, he made a show of being the doting brother. The air in the grand foyer was thick with the scent of roses that Elena had arranged for one of her charity events. Ben greeted him with that easy, confident smile of his, a firm handshake that told Martin everything he needed to know. This man wasn't to be underestimated. Martin, Ben said warmly, his eyes twinkling, I've heard so much about your help with Elena's finances. She speaks highly of your support during her difficult time. Martin forced a grin, his teeth clenched behind his lips. Well, family is family, right? He replied. I'm just happy to help Elena in any way I can. Ben's smile didn't falter, but there was a glimmer of something in his eyes, something calculating. Of course, Ben agreed smoothly. Still, I think it's high time we went through the accounts together, just to make sure everything's in order. It's good to have a fresh perspective, don't you think? Martin's heart skipped again, but he maintained his composure. Absolutely, Ben. Just let me know when you're ready, and I'd be happy to walk you through it. But as he left the estate that evening, Martin's mind was racing. He knew what Ben was after. Ben wasn't just a loving husband concerned with Elena's finances. He was digging, searching for something. And if Ben found even a hint of the transfers Martin had been making, everything would come crashing down. Martin's usually smooth demeanor started to crack in the following days. He spent sleepless nights in his own study, poring over the records he'd manipulated, looking for any telltale signs he might have missed. He needed to cover his tracks, but how could he do that with Ben now watching every transaction like a hawk? A week later, Ben called Martin over to the estate. They were to go over the financials together, something that Martin dreaded but couldn't avoid without arousing suspicion. He arrived dressed impeccably in his tailored suit, trying to exude confidence, but inside, he was a mess of nerves. Ben led him into the study, William's old study, now converted into Ben's workspace. The room had a different aura now. Gone were the old paintings and antique furniture, replaced by sleek modern decor and a cutting-edge computer system. Have a seat, Martin, Ben said, gesturing to the leather chair opposite his desk. I've been going over the records, and I have to say, there are a few things I'd love your insight on. Martin's throat went dry, but he managed a nonchalant smile. Of course, happy to help, he said, settling into the chair. Ben flipped open a laptop and turned the screen toward Martin. See, I've been noticing these recurring withdrawals, all labeled as estate management expenses, but the amounts, well, they're rather substantial, wouldn't you say? Martin leaned forward, pretending to scrutinize the screen. Ah, yes, those. They were for various maintenance projects, repairs around the estate, upgrades to the security system. William always insisted on keeping everything top-notch. Ben nodded slowly, his expression neutral, but there was a flicker of doubt in his eyes. Strange, though. I checked with the contractors who were supposedly paid for these projects. None of them have records of receiving those amounts. Martin's stomach twisted, but he refused to let his smile waver. Well, you know how it is with contractors. They're not always the most organized, he said with a forced chuckle. Sometimes payments get lost in the paperwork. Ben leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. I'm sure that's the case, he said lightly. but there was an edge to his voice now. "Still, I'd like to do a deeper audit, just to be certain. After all, it's Elena's future we're talking about here." There it was, the thinly veiled threat. Martin knew he was on borrowed time. Ben was too smart, too meticulous. He wouldn't stop until he had all the answers, and Martin was running out of places to hide the truth. As Martin left the estate that day, he knew he had to act fast. Ben was closing in, and it was only a matter of time before his secret embezzlement came to light. He couldn't afford to lose everything he'd taken, not now, not after all these years of careful planning. "Enjoy your time at the top, Ben," Martin muttered under his breath as he walked away. "Because when I'm through with you, you'll wish you'd never stuck your nose where it didn't belong." And so, the stage was set for a silent war between the two men. One was driven by love and a desire to protect his new wife, while the other was fueled by greed, desperation, and a determination to hold onto his ill-gotten gains at any cost. Martin Whitlock was a man who had grown accustomed to life's luxuries. His days were filled with the finest wines, custom-made suits, and lavish parties where he could bask in the glow of wealth and influence. Every morning, he would wake in his opulent bedroom, the sun filtering through the silk curtains Elena had imported from Italy to the scent of rich, freshly brewed coffee. His routine was a symphony of indulgence, from the breakfast spreads laid out by the estate chef to the afternoons spent golfing at exclusive country clubs. But beneath that polished exterior, Martin was a man teetering on the edge of ruin. The life he had built, the one he cherished so dearly, was about to collapse like a house of cards. It all came down to one person, Ben Thompson, his sister's new husband. Ben was methodical, cautious, and worst of all, determined to protect Elena. Martin's blood ran cold every time he thought of Ben hunched over those spreadsheets, searching for every discrepancy, every transaction that didn't quite add up. It was only a matter of time before he stumbled upon Martin's dirty little secret, the years of subtle embezzlement that had funded his extravagant lifestyle. The Whitlock estate, Elena's sprawling manor, had become Martin's personal playground. Ever since his brother-in-law William's passing, Martin had been his sister's rock, or at least, that's what she believed. In reality, he had taken advantage of Elena's grief, her vulnerability, to worm his way into her finances. He justified it to himself 1,000 times. She wouldn't miss a few thousand here, a few thousand there, but now, all those small, harmless siphons were on the verge of being exposed by the man she'd married in what felt like the blink of an eye. Martin stared out the bay window of his study, fingers drumming anxiously on the mahogany desk. His gaze drifted over the perfectly manicured gardens that stretched beyond the estate, the very gardens he had convinced Elena needed constant upkeep, a euphemism for the hefty amounts he pocketed from her accounts. A knock at the door jolted him from his thoughts. It was Greta, the housekeeper, with her usual polite demeanor. "Mr. Whitlock, your car is ready," she said, bowing slightly as she spoke. Martin waved her away dismissively. Yes, I'll be down in a moment," he muttered, not even bothering to look up. He was scheduled to meet a potential client at the golf club, but the idea of discussing investments and stocks felt trivial when his entire life was hanging by a thread. He couldn't shake the feeling that Ben was just inches away from uncovering everything. And once he did, Martin knew Elena would cut him off completely. No more free-flowing champagne, no more lavish dinners, no more first-class trips to Monaco. He would be left to fend for himself, something he had no intention of allowing. Later that evening, as Martin nursed a glass of scotch, he found himself pacing the length of his study, his mind racing. The room was dimly lit, the only sound being the soft crackle of the fireplace. Think, Martin. Think, he told himself. Ben's impending audit was a sword hanging over his head. He couldn't outrun it, couldn't cover his tracks fast enough to avoid detection. But perhaps he could find a way to turn the tables. The sound of the door creaking open interrupted his thoughts. Elena entered, her presence as elegant as ever in a flowing silk gown. She smiled warmly at her brother, unaware of the storm brewing behind his eyes. "Martin," she said, crossing the room to pour herself a glass of wine. "You've been so tense lately. Is everything all right?" Martin forced a smile, the mask of the concerned brother slipping into place. "Just business matters. Nothing for you to worry about," he said smoothly, watching her carefully. "But speaking of which, how are things with Ben? He's been rather busy with those accounts, hasn't he?" Elena sighed, a faint crease forming on her brow. "Yes, he has. But you know Ben, he's thorough. He just wants to make sure everything's in order." She paused, taking a sip of her wine. "Actually, he's found a few strange things in the books. I told him it must be from before William passed." Martin's heart skipped a beat. He felt the world closing in around him, but he kept his tone light. "I'm sure it's nothing, just old errors. You know how chaotic things were after William's sudden departure." Elena nodded slowly, but there was a hint of uncertainty in her eyes now. She trusted her brother, but Ben's concerns had planted a seed of doubt. As she left the room, Martin's mask finally slipped and his face twisted into a scowl. He downed the rest of his scotch, slamming the glass onto the table. He was running out of time. If Ben continued digging, there would be no escape. But then an idea began to take root. Desperate times called for desperate measures, didn't they? If Ben was determined to ruin him, then perhaps it was time for Martin to play a different game. A game where he held all the cards. What if something were to happen to Ben? The thought was sinister, even for Martin, but the desperation clawed at him, urging him forward. He couldn't risk Ben finding those transfers. But if Ben were distracted, perhaps even incapacitated, he would no longer pose a threat. The idea was both terrifying and thrilling. Martin's mind began to weave a plan, one that would keep his secrets buried and his life of luxury intact. "No one takes what's mine," Martin whispered to himself, a twisted smile spreading across his lips. The next morning, Martin was back to his usual charming self, greeting Elena with a kiss on the cheek and a reassuring pat on the back. But behind those friendly eyes, a darker plan was taking shape. He would protect his lifestyle at any cost. And if that meant eliminating Ben, well, Martin was willing to cross that line. "Enjoy your investigations while you can, Ben," Martin thought to himself, his eyes gleaming with newfound resolve. "Because soon enough, you'll be too busy to worry about old accounts." And with that, Martin set into motion the gears of a sinister plan, one that would either save him or destroy him entirely. The only thing left now was to wait for the perfect moment to strike. Martin Whitlock was no stranger to deception. He had lied, manipulated, and stolen his way into a life of luxury, and now, with everything hanging in the balance, he knew there was only one way to keep it. His heart pounded as he paced back and forth in his dimly lit study. The velvet drapes were drawn, casting the room in shadows. Outside, the wind howled through the trees like a harbinger of the dark, thoughts swirling in Martin's mind. "Ben has to go," Martin whispered to himself, the words slipping through clenched teeth like a curse. There was no other option left. If Ben Thompson continued to dig into Elena's accounts, it wouldn't be long before Martin's years of embezzlement were exposed. The life he had carefully constructed, the parties, the fine clothes, the indulgent weekends at luxury resorts, all of it would come crashing down. And worse, Elena would cut him off entirely. But how could he get rid of Ben without arousing suspicion? He needed a plan that was foolproof, one that couldn't be traced back to him in any way. And as he mulled over his options, the answer came to him like a flash of lightning. Zeus. The powerful Doberman that Ben adored was the perfect weapon. If Martin could manipulate the situation just right, it would look like a tragic accident, a vicious attack from an unpredictable dog. No one would suspect foul play, least of all Elena, who was completely oblivious to the seething hatred Martin harbored for her husband. Martin took a deep breath, trying to calm the frantic beating of his heart. He had always prided himself on his ability to remain calm under pressure, but this was different. This time, it was about survival. He walked over to the ornate bar cart and poured himself a generous glass of bourbon. As he took a long, slow sip, he allowed the burn of the liquor to steady his nerves. He needed to think this through carefully. Zeus was fiercely loyal to Ben, but Martin knew that even the most loyal dog could be turned. He had spent enough time sweet-talking the Doberman, rubbing behind its ears and slipping it treats when Ben wasn't looking. The dog knew Martin's scent, trusted him even. That was something he could use to his advantage. Martin's mind raced as he began to formulate his plan. The key was to get Zeus to attack Ben, but he couldn't rely on chance. No! It had to be deliberate, calculated, yet appear entirely accidental. Martin's lips curved into a cold smile. This would take cunning and patience, but it was the perfect way to eliminate his rival without getting his own hands dirty. The following day, Martin put the wheels of his scheme in motion. He made a point of being seen around the estate, especially when Ben was out at work. He would linger in the garden, calling out to Zeus in a friendly tone, letting the dog get used to his voice and presence. "Hey, boy! Come here," Martin cooed, crouching down and extending his hand with a piece of juicy steak. Zeus trotted over, tail wagging, and sniffed the offering before snapping it up with a satisfied growl. Martin chuckled softly, patting the dog's head. "You're a good boy, aren't you, Zeus? But what if you had a little more bite?" His voice was a low murmur, almost conspiratorial. The dog, of course, didn't understand the words, but it understood the tone, warm, soothing, a promise of more treats to come. But treats alone wouldn't be enough to trigger the deadly attack Martin needed. No! He needed something that would drive Zeus into a frenzy, something that would override the dog's loyalty to Ben. That's when Martin remembered a trick he had learned years ago from a less-than-reputable friend. There was a scent, a simple mix of chemicals that could send even the calmest dog into a fit of rage. Martin's plan crystallized. He would douse Ben's favorite jacket with the scent, just enough to make Zeus see red. Then, when the time was right, he would slip it into Ben's path. It was late one evening when Martin decided to put his plan into action. The estate was quiet, Elena having retired early, and Ben was working late in his study. Martin had stolen into the garage earlier and found Ben's worn leather jacket hanging on a hook. It was the one Ben wore on his morning jogs. The perfect opportunity for Zeus to strike. Martin carefully applied the chemical mixture to the inside of the jacket. It was odorless to humans, but would drive a dog wild. He smiled to himself as he hung it back up, making sure everything looked exactly as it had before. Tomorrow, Martin thought as he slipped back to his room, it will all be over. The next morning dawned bright and cold. Martin watched from his window as Ben prepared for his usual jog, oblivious to the doom that awaited him. Zeus was already bounding around the yard, eager to accompany his master. "See you in an hour," Ben called cheerfully to Elena, who waved from the doorway. Martin watched with bated breath as Ben reached for his jacket and slipped it on. He next morning dawned bright and cold. Martin watched from his window as Ben prepared for his usual jog, oblivious to the doom that awaited him. Zeus was already bounding around the yard, eager to accompany his master. "See you in an hour," Ben called cheerfully to Elena, who waved from the doorway. Zeus, usually calm and composed, immediately stiffened. His ears went back, and a low growl rumbled in his throat. Ben frowned and turned to the dog. "What's gotten into you, boy?" Ben asked, confused by the sudden change in the dog's demeanor. Martin's heart raced as he watched from behind the curtain. This was it. The chemical was working. All it would take was one more push. He waited for the moment when Ben turned his back to the dog. "Now, Zeus," Martin whispered to himself, eyes glinting with anticipation. And then it happened. Zeus lunged, jaws snapping, driven into a frenzy by the scent that now seemed to permeate the air around Ben. Ben cried out in shock, trying to fend off the dog's powerful jaws. But Zeus was relentless, teeth sinking into flesh. From his vantage point, Martin could see the horror unfolding. Elena running out in her robe, screaming for Zeus to stop, Ben's desperate struggle as the dog bore him to the ground. But to everyone else, It would look like a tragic accident, a moment when a beloved pet simply lost control. Martin allowed himself a small, satisfied smile. "It's done," he muttered to himself, stepping away from the window. His heart still pounded, but this time it was from exhilaration, not fear. He had done it. He had secured his future, and no one would ever know the truth. As the sounds of Elena's sobs echoed through the house, Martin poured himself another drink. He raised a glass in a silent toast. "To a life well lived," he said, savoring the victory, "and to those who stand in the way." But even as he savored the taste of his triumph, a small, nagging thought began to gnaw at the back of his mind. What if someone somehow discovered what he had done? Martin was a man who prided himself on always being 2 steps ahead. He had outsmarted competitors, swindled investors, and sweet-talked his way into his sister Elena's good graces. But now, as he stared at the slim, unassuming metal device in his palm, he couldn't help but marvel at the simplicity of his new plan. The key to eliminating Ben Thompson had come in a way Martin never would have expected, through the power of sound. It had all started with an article Martin stumbled upon during one of his sleepless nights. Restless and plagued by thoughts of Ben sniffing around Elena's finances, Martin had turned to the internet for a distraction. That's when he read about Ivan Pavlov, the renowned scientist who famously trained dogs to associate a ringing bell with food. Pavlov's dogs would salivate at the mere sound, conditioned to expect a treat. But what if, Martin mused, you could train a dog to respond to something much more sinister? That's when he discovered the concept of the hypersonic whistle. The article detailed how certain frequencies could trigger intense reactions in dogs, sounds too high-pitched for human ears, but capable of driving canines into a frenzy. "Interesting," Martin muttered to himself, leaning closer to the screen. His eyes flickered with a dangerous light as a plan began to form. If Pavlov could train dogs to salivate at the sound of a bell, then surely Martin could condition Zeus, Ben's beloved Doberman, to respond to the whistle in a far more violent manner. The next day, Martin made a discreet purchase online. The device arrived within 2 days, a slim, sleek whistle, deceptively simple in its design. It looked like nothing more than a child's toy, but Martin knew its potential. The frequency could be adjusted with a tiny dial, allowing him to find the exact pitch that would drive Zeus wild. Martin studied the whistle with the meticulous attention of a jeweler inspecting a rare diamond. He turned it over in his hands, feeling the cold, smooth metal against his skin. "This is it," he whispered to himself. "This little thing, it's going to solve all my problems." The first step was to test its range and effect. He waited until Ben was away at work and Elena was occupied in the house. Then, Martin made his way out to the garden where Zeus was lounging under the shade of a tree, his muscular body relaxed, unaware of the sinister intentions of the man approaching him. "Hey, big guy," Martin called softly, tossing a treat in Zeus's direction. The dog's ears perked up and he bounded over, tail wagging. Martin waited until Zeus was mere feet away before he lifted the whistle to his lips and gave it a sharp, quick blow. There was no sound, at least none that Martin could hear. But Zeus's reaction was immediate and alarming. The Doberman's entire body tensed, his eyes wide, ears flattened against his skull. He began to growl, a deep, guttural sound that sent a shiver down Martin's spine. "Perfect," Martin breathed, his eyes gleaming with satisfaction. Zeus's reaction was exactly what he had hoped for. The dog was clearly agitated, confused, looking for a threat that didn't exist. Martin quickly slipped the whistle back into his pocket and tossed another treat to the Doberman, his tone soothing. "It's all right, boy. It's all right," Martin cooed, his voice honeyed and gentle. Zeus hesitated, then cautiously took the treat, his eyes still darting around nervously. Martin reached out, patting the dog's head. "Good boy. You're going to help me, aren't you? You just don't know it yet." Over the next few days, Martin put his plan into action. He needed to condition Zeus to associate the whistle with aggression. It required patience, a steady hand, and more than a few juicy steaks to keep the Doberman's trust. Every day, while Ben was away, Martin would visit the garden, whistle in hand. At first, Zeus would simply growl or bark in response to the sound. But Martin was relentless. He adjusted the frequency, finding the pitch that seemed to trigger the strongest reaction. Then he began pairing the sound with increasingly intense stimuli, like jabbing a sharp stick into the ground near Zeus or shaking a metal can filled with coins. The goal was simple: make the dog associate the whistle with a threat that needed to be attacked. "Come on, Zeus, show me that fire," Martin would murmur under his breath each time he blew the whistle. The dog's reactions became more violent with each session. Zeus would snap at the air, teeth bared, eyes wild with fury. The once friendly Doberman was transforming into a weapon, and Martin couldn't help but revel in his success. But he had to be careful. Elena was beginning to notice the change in Zeus's behavior. "He's been so restless lately," she mentioned one evening at dinner, her brow furrowed. "Ben thinks he's stressed. I'm worried something's wrong." Martin merely shrugged, hiding his smirk behind his wine glass. "Dogs can be unpredictable," he said, voice smooth. "Maybe he just needs a bit more exercise." Inwardly, though, he was thrilled. The conditioning was working better than he'd hoped. Zeus was becoming exactly what Martin needed. A ticking time bomb waiting to explode the final test came one stormy afternoon when the house was quiet. Elena had gone to town, and Ben was in his study. Martin seized the opportunity to bring Zeus to the brink. He slipped into the garden, rain drizzling down in cold sheets. Zeus was already on edge, pacing restlessly. "Let's see if you're ready," Martin muttered, pulling the whistle from his pocket. He turned the dial to its highest setting and blew a long, piercing blast. Zeus went berserk. The Doberman lunged at the nearest tree, ripping into the bark with his teeth, his eyes wild and unfocused. His snarls filled the garden, almost drowning out the sound of the rain. Martin watched in awe, a twisted smile stretching across his lips. This was the beast he had created, a force of nature that would soon be unleashed on Ben. "Soon, Zeus, soon," Martin whispered as he watched the dog. "You're going to do exactly what I trained you to do, and when it's all over, no one will suspect a thing." He turned on his heel and walked back inside, the echo of Zeus's feral growls following him like a promise. The stage was set, and the whistle was ready. All Martin needed now was the perfect moment to put his deadly scheme into motion. As the storm raged outside, Martin poured himself another glass of bourbon, his eyes gleaming with anticipation. In his hands, he held a weapon that no one could trace back to him. And soon, Ben Thompson would be nothing more than a tragic casualty in what everyone would believe was a freak accident. To the perfect crime, Martin toasted to himself, raising his glass with a wicked grin. Asterisk, and to getting away with murder. Asterisk. The plan was almost perfect, but Martin knew he couldn't afford any loose ends. Zeus had become increasingly aggressive thanks to the hypersonic whistle training, but Martin needed to ensure absolute obedience. That at the crucial moment, Zeus would attack with deadly precision. The hypersonic whistle alone wasn't enough. There needed to be an element that would override Zeus's loyalty to Ben and drive him into a frenzy. That's when Martin came up with his next ingenious and sinister idea, an electric collar. The collar Martin had in mind was no ordinary dog accessory. This wasn't one of those humane training collars that gave a gentle buzz to discourage bad behavior. No, this was something far more potent, something that would leave Zeus writhing in agony with the press of a button. Martin had found the device through a shady online forum, the kind of place where anonymous sellers hawk gadgets for everything from disabling security systems to tampering with car brakes. It was expensive, but Martin knew it would be worth every penny if it meant securing his luxurious lifestyle. A few days later, a nondescript brown package arrived at Martin's doorstep. He wasted no time tearing it open, revealing a sleek, black collar lined with tiny metal prongs on the inside. They looked harmless enough at first glance, but Martin knew these prongs would deliver an excruciating electric shock when activated. Perfect, he whispered to himself, running his fingers over the cold metal. The collar came with a small remote control, but that wouldn't work for Martin's needs. It was too obvious, too easily detectable. So he set to work in his basement, hunched over a cluttered workbench filled with tools, wires, and circuit boards. Martin had always been good with electronics, a talent he had honed during his college years when he needed to rig slot machines and ATMs to supplement his lifestyle. Now, those same skills would help him seal Ben's fate. Using spare parts, Martin reconfigured the collar so that it could be triggered remotely from a switch he would hide in the basement, far away from prying eyes. As he tightened the last screw on his modified collar, Martin couldn't help but chuckle to himself. "They'll never see it coming," he muttered. "No one will ever suspect the dog." The next challenge was getting Zeus to wear the collar without Ben or Elena noticing the modifications. Martin needed to be subtle, so he waited for a moment when he knew Ben would be occupied with work and Elena would be out shopping. Zeus, however, was not as easy to deceive. The Doberman had grown wary of Martin over the past weeks. Perhaps it was the scent of fear that clung to Martin whenever he blew the whistle, or maybe it was the change in Martin's tone. That oily sweetness that came when he tried to win over the dog. "Hey, boy, look what I've got for you," Martin cooed, holding up a juicy slab of steak in one hand and the collar in the other. Zeus eyed him suspiciously, his ears twitching. "Come on, Zeus. Don't be difficult," Martin said with a forced smile. The Doberman's growl rumbled low in his throat, but the smell of the meat was too tempting. Zeus lunged forward, tearing into the steak with a vengeance. And in that brief moment of distraction, Martin clasped the collar around the dog's neck. "There we go," Martin murmured, stepping back quickly before Zeus could react. "That wasn't so bad, was it?" The Doberman shook his head, trying to dislodge the foreign object, but Martin was quick to divert his attention with another piece of meat. "Good boy, Zeus," he said, his voice smooth and calm. "You'll get used to it." Over the next week, Martin began conditioning Zeus with the electric collar. It was a slow and painstaking process, but Martin was nothing if not patient. He would stand in the basement, fingers hovering over the hidden switch, while watching Zeus through the small, grimy window that looked out into the backyard. The first time he activated the collar, Zeus let out a yelp that echoed through the garden, his body convulsing as the electric current surged through him. Martin's lips curled into a cold, cruel smile as he watched the dog stumble, his eyes wild with confusion. "That's it," Martin whispered to himself, his voice barely audible. "You'll learn, Zeus. You'll learn to do exactly as I say." He paired the electric shock with the hypersonic whistle, creating a Pavlovian nightmare. Every time the whistle blew, Zeus would receive a jolt of pain, driving him into a blind rage. The first few sessions were chaotic, with Zeus tearing at the grass and barking furiously, trying to escape the invisible torment. But gradually, the conditioning took hold. Zeus began to associate the whistle sound with the unbearable pain of the electric shock, and his reactions grew more intense. One afternoon, Martin decided to test how far he could push Zeus. He stood in the basement, the hidden switch clutched in his hand, while Ben and Elena were upstairs enjoying a quiet lunch. Martin blew the whistle once, then pressed the switch. Zeus's growl turned into a furious roar, and he began clawing at the door that led to the house. Martin's heart raced as he watched the Doberman's frenzied response. "Yes, yes," he whispered excitedly. "That's it. You're ready, aren't you, Zeus?" Just as quickly, Martin released the switch, and the dog collapsed, panting heavily, foam gathering at the corners of his mouth. The training was working, and soon Zeus would be the perfect instrument for Martin's plan. The dog would respond to the whistle not just with anger, but with lethal intent. And all it would take was one well-timed command to unleash him on Ben. One evening, as Martin sat sipping a glass of scotch in the dimly lit living room, Elena entered with a worried expression. "Martin, have you noticed Zeus acting strange lately?" she asked, her brow furrowed. Martin leaned back in his chair, feigning ignorance. "Strange? How so?" He's been so agitated, almost as if he's in pain, Elena said, her voice tinged with concern. Ben thinks we might need to take him to the vet. Martin's heart skipped a beat, but he masked it with a dismissive wave. Oh, you know how dogs are. He's probably just picking up on some stress around the house. You and Ben have been so busy lately. Maybe Zeus just needs more attention. Elena sighed, clearly torn between her love for the dog and her busy schedule. Maybe you're right, she said softly, but I hope he gets back to normal soon. Martin watched her leave the room, a sinister grin spreading across his face. Oh, he will, Martin muttered to himself, but not in the way you expect. With the collar and whistle conditioning complete, all Martin needed now was the perfect moment to set his deadly scheme into motion. Martin knew that simply inflicting pain on Zeus through the collar wasn't enough. He needed the Doberman to trust him, to see Martin not as the source of pain but as the one who could relieve it. This was crucial for his plan to work. The conditioning had to be seamless, turning Zeus into a weapon that would respond not with fear, but with fierce loyalty to Martin alone. The plan required a delicate balance: punish and reward, pain and relief. If done correctly, Zeus would come to see Martin as a savior, the one person who could stop the agony, the only figure who could soothe his tortured nerves. Martin needed Zeus to crave his presence, to respond to his commands as though they were the key to survival. It was a twisted psychological game, but Martin had read enough about behavioral conditioning to know it would work. It started one cold, dreary afternoon. Martin stood in the basement, eyes narrowed as he watched Zeus through the small window that overlooked the backyard. The Doberman paced restlessly, his body tense and his eyes darting around. He was on edge, likely anticipating another sudden jolt from the collar. Martin knew he had to strike a delicate balance today. It was time to introduce the new phase of conditioning. With the hidden remote in his hand, Martin pressed the button. The collar activated, sending a sharp current through Zeus's muscular frame. The dog let out a pained howl, dropping to the ground as his limbs convulsed. Martin watched with cold eyes, waiting. Now, he whispered to himself, and then quickly pressed another button to deactivate the shock. He grabbed a handful of treats, the good kind, the ones infused with beef and gravy, and headed outside. The moment Martin stepped into the backyard, Zeus was still panting heavily, his eyes wild with residual fear. But Martin approached him slowly, speaking in a low, soothing voice. "Easy, boy. It's okay now," Martin murmured, holding out a treat. Zeus hesitated, his body trembling, but the scent of the treat was too tempting. He inched closer, his eyes never leaving Martin's face. "That's right. Good boy," Martin cooed as Zeus finally snatched the treat from his hand. The Doberman devoured the treat hungrily, his eyes momentarily softening. Martin crouched down, reaching out a hand to stroke the dog's fur. "You see, Zeus? I'm the one who makes it stop. I'm the one who brings you relief." For the next few days, Martin repeated this cruel game. He would watch Zeus from his hidden spot in the basement, waiting until the dog seemed to relax before pressing the button again. Each time, the electric jolt would send Zeus into a frenzied panic. And each time, Martin would swoop in like a savior with treats and gentle words, calming the dog, feeding him, and stroking his fur until the trembling subsided. After a week of this twisted conditioning, Martin could see the change in Zeus. The dog was now associating Martin's presence with relief, a reprieve from the agony of the collar. The moment Martin stepped into the backyard after triggering the shock, Zeus would practically leap towards him, desperate for the treats and the soothing words. One afternoon, as Martin approached the backyard after another shock session, he noticed how quickly Zeus ran to him, tail wagging nervously. "Good boy, Zeus," Martin said, offering another treat. The dog's eyes were no longer filled with suspicion, but with a kind of desperate gratitude. It was working. The Doberman had been effectively conditioned to see Martin as the only source of comfort amidst his pain. Martin decided it was time to up the stakes. He would test how deep this conditioning ran. Could he really turn Zeus against the one person the dog loved most, Ben? It was a sunny Saturday morning when Martin set his next trap. He waited until he heard Ben's car pull into the driveway. As soon as he was sure his brother-in-law was inside the house, Martin pressed the button. Zeus, who had been lounging in the garden, instantly let out a yelp, his body jerking from the shock. Martin kept the button pressed just a second longer than usual this time, pushing Zeus to the brink. Then he quickly released it and sprinted outside, treats in hand. "Zeus, come here, boy," he called out, his voice dripping with false concern. Zeus bounded toward him, eyes wide with panic, but filled with an almost pleading expression. Good boy," Martin muttered, crouching down to feed him treats. He could see it in Zeus's eyes, that frantic, grateful gaze that said, "Thank you for making it stop." In that moment, Martin knew he had succeeded. Zeus was now fully conditioned. The dog no longer feared Martin. In fact, he sought him out, believing that only Martin could bring relief from the torment he experienced. It was a twisted bond, one forged in pain and relief. And Martin felt a sick thrill knowing that he now held Zeus's mind in the palm of his hand. But Martin wasn't done yet. He needed to test one final step. That evening, when Ben was in the garden with Zeus, Martin watched from the shadows of the house. He had the whistle in his pocket, ready to blow at a moment's notice. Ben was distracted, checking his phone, while Zeus sat patiently by his side. Martin waited, his heart pounding in his chest. He reached into his pocket, retrieved the whistle, and blew it softly. At the same time, his finger hovered over the hidden button. Zeus's ears twitched at the sound, and his body tensed. Without hesitation, Martin pressed the button, sending a shock through the collar. The effect was instantaneous. Zeus let out a growl, so deep it seemed to rumble through the ground. His eyes, normally soft when looking at Ben, turned wild and feral. "Zeus? Hey, what's wrong, boy?" Ben asked, frowning as he reached out to pat the dog's head. But Zeus's growl only grew louder, and for a terrifying moment, Martin thought the dog might attack right then and there. Martin quickly released the button, and Zeus's growl subsided. Though the dog remained on edge, his eyes flickering between Ben and the spot where Martin stood hidden. "Strange," Ben muttered, shaking his head, before turning back toward the house. "Must be something in the air?" Martin watched, his hands trembling with excitement. Zeus had been ready to attack on command. All that was left now was to fine-tune the timing and wait for the perfect moment to execute his plan. "He's ready," Martin whispered to himself, a sinister smile spreading across his face. "When the time comes, Ben, not even your loyal dog will save you. In fact, he'll be the one to finish you off." Zeus had been conditioned to perfection. Now, it was only a matter of time before Martin unleashed the final act of his deadly scheme. Martin stood at the front door, waving enthusiastically as Elena and Ben drove away, the sound of their cars slowly fading into the distance. The newlyweds were headed to New York for their long-awaited 2-week honeymoon, leaving behind their luxurious home and, most importantly, their loyal Doberman Zeus under Martin's care. As the car disappeared around the corner, Martin's cheerful expression melted into one of cold determination. This was the opportunity he had been waiting for. 2 entire weeks without Ben's watchful eyes, and he could finally put the finishing touches on his sinister plan. He could feel the adrenaline pulsing through his veins as he turned away from the door and headed towards the house, his mind racing with dark intentions. That evening, Martin sat alone in the dimly lit kitchen, nursing a glass of expensive whiskey from Ben's private stash. He raised the glass in a mock toast. "To you, Ben. Enjoy your honeymoon while you still can," he muttered to himself, a cruel smile playing at the corners of his lips. He was confident that by the time the couple returned, Zeus would be fully prepared to carry out Martin's lethal scheme. The house was eerily quiet without Elena's laughter or Ben's deep, steady voice. Zeus padded softly across the hardwood floors, his eyes wary as he watched Martin. The dog was still on edge from the weeks of conditioning, but he had grown increasingly dependent on Martin's presence, seeing him as the one source of relief from his pain. Martin leaned down, his voice low and soothing. "Ah, Zeus, my loyal friend, we've still got work to do, don't we?" He reached into his pocket and pulled out a treat, tossing it to the Doberman, who caught it midair with a swift snap of his jaws. The dog's tail wagged cautiously. Martin knew that Zeus was still confused, torn between his natural loyalty to Ben and the twisted conditioning Martin had subjected him to. But Martin was patient. He had 2 whole weeks to turn that confusion into unwavering obedience. The next morning, Martin wasted no time. He had transformed the basement into a training ground, a secret place where he could work on perfecting Zeus's conditioning without any interruptions. The thick, soundproof walls ensured that no one outside would hear the high-pitched whistles or the occasional yelp of pain when Martin activated the electric collar. "All right, boy. Time to get to work," Martin said, leading Zeus down the stairs. The dog hesitated, his eyes darting nervously around the darkened basement. But Martin was relentless. "Come on, Zeus. You know who's in control here," he added, pressing the button on the remote just enough to send a faint warning shock. Zeus whimpered but obediently followed. Martin had grown meticulous with his methods. He knew that simply associating the whistle with pain wasn't enough. The true challenge was to ensure that Zeus would react to the whistle with violent aggression, but only towards Ben. That meant using the time he had alone with the dog to deepen the conditioning. The days passed in a blur of brutal training sessions. Martin would play recordings of Ben's voice while blowing the silent dog whistle and simultaneously activating the collar. Zeus would react instinctively, growling at the sound of Ben's voice. Even though the real man was miles away in a Manhattan hotel, blissfully unaware of the horrors being inflicted on his beloved pet. "Listen, Zeus," Martin would whisper as he crouched in front of the panting, trembling dog, his eyes gleaming with cruel satisfaction. "It's his fault, isn't it? Ben's the one causing you all this pain. But don't worry. Soon you'll have your chance to stop it." He would then reward Zeus with a treat, stroking his fur until the dog calmed down, reinforcing the twisted bond he had forged. Every day, Martin would push Zeus a little further, testing how quickly he could get the dog to shift from calm obedience to aggressive rage at the sound of the whistle. He kept the sessions short but intense, knowing that overexerting the Doberman could backfire. By the end of the first week, Zeus was reacting to the whistle with immediate snarls and bared teeth. Martin couldn't help but chuckle to himself after each session. "Perfect," he would mutter. "Absolutely perfect." One rainy afternoon, with just a few days left before Ben and Elena's return, Martin decided to conduct his most critical test. He had set up a life-size cutout of Ben in the basement, wearing one of Ben's old shirts that Martin had swiped from the laundry hamper. The scent of Ben on the fabric combined with the recordings of his voice would be the ultimate test to see if Zeus was truly ready. "All right, boy, this is it," Martin said, crouching down to Zeus's level. He blew the whistle and simultaneously pressed a button on the electric collar. Zeus's reaction was instantaneous. The Doberman lunged at the cutout, tearing into it with a ferocity that sent shreds of paper and fabric flying through the air. Martin's laughter echoed through the basement as he watched Zeus reduce the cardboard figure to nothing but scraps. "Yes, that's it, Zeus. That's exactly what I need," Martin roared triumphantly, his eyes alight with madness. He walked over to the Doberman, who was panting heavily, eyes still wild. "Good boy, very good boy," he whispered, rewarding the dog with a handful of treats. Zeus devoured the treats eagerly, his gaze fixed on Martin with a look that was a disturbing mix of loyalty and fear. The conditioning had worked. The dog was now a weapon, programmed to respond to the whistle with lethal aggression, all aimed at Ben. As the final day of Elena and Ben's honeymoon approached, Martin stood at the window, staring out at the darkening sky. He felt a chill of excitement run down his spine. Everything was in place. Zeus was ready, conditioned to a level of precision that Martin hadn't thought possible just weeks ago. He poured himself another glass of whiskey, raising it once again in a mock toast. "Enjoy your last days, Ben," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the sound of the rain tapping against the windows. "Because when you return, your own loyal dog will be the one to end you." The house was still and silent, save for the occasional soft growl from Zeus as he lay at Martin's feet, awaiting the next command. The stage was set, the final act ready to unfold. All Martin had to do was wait. When Ben and Elena returned, they would have no idea that the very creature they trusted and loved had been transformed into an instrument of death. The day finally arrived. The sound of the front door swinging open echoed through the grand hallway of the Thompson estate. Elena and Ben had returned from their honeymoon in New York, their laughter and voices carrying through the house as they made their way inside. The trip had been everything they hoped for: romantic, relaxing, a brief escape from the world. Little did they know, while they had been away, the world inside their own home had been shifting beneath their feet, and the darkness they left behind was waiting to greet them. Elena's voice rang out, full of excitement as she walked through the door, her suitcase rolling behind her. "We're back," she called out. "Martin, Zeus, we're home." From the kitchen, Martin quickly set down the glass of whiskey he had been nursing and straightened up. A smile spread across his face as he heard Elena's voice. He had rehearsed this moment in his mind, preparing for the return of the newlyweds and their dog. He needed to be the perfect host, charming and composed, all while hiding the malicious plot that was unfolding beneath the surface. "Welcome back," Martin called, stepping into the foyer to greet them. He feigned a look of warmth and enthusiasm, making sure his voice was filled with that same faux cheerfulness. His heart raced, but he kept his demeanor calm, pretending everything was exactly as it should be. Ben, looking tan and relaxed from their trip, reached out to shake Martin's hand. "Good to be back, man. New York was amazing, but it's nice to return home." His eyes glanced around the grand house, and for a brief moment, he seemed to study it with more intent, almost as if he could sense that something had changed in their absence. But then he turned toward Martin, smiling. "How's everything been?" "Great," Martin replied, nodding slightly. "Everything's been just as it should be. You know, Zeus has been a good boy. Kept me company while you were gone." "Zeus!" Elena squealed in delight, her eyes lighting up as she dropped her bag onto the floor. She rushed past Martin and towards the living room where Zeus was lying calmly, his massive body stretched out lazily on the rug. The dog, seeing his beloved owner return, jumped up at once, his tail wagging furiously. For a brief moment, there was no sign of the aggression that Martin had carefully nurtured into the animal. Zeus appeared as friendly, loving, and obedient as ever, nuzzling Elena's hand as she bent down to pet him. "There's my good boy," Elena cooed, scratching behind Zeus's ears. The Doberman leaned into her touch, licking her face affectionately as if the two had never been apart. It was as if nothing had changed at all, and yet everything had. Ben, standing behind Elena, smiled at the reunion. "He looks like he's been spoiled. What did you do to him while we were gone, Martin?" Martin chuckled, his smile never faltering. "Spoiled him? No, just kept him company. Took him on a few walks around the estate. You know, just the basics. He's really attached to you, Elena." He added the last part with a touch of feigned sincerity. But inside, Martin was seething. The whole time, the dog had been nothing but a tool, a weapon, a means to an end. He had spent the past weeks conditioning Zeus to be a perfect instrument of violence. And yet, in front of Elena and Ben, the dog seemed as gentle and docile as ever. It sickened Martin, knowing that the plan was set in motion, but the dog had no idea of its role in the twisted scheme he had engineered. Elena stood up and faced Martin, her expression shifting slightly as she noticed the tension in the air. She had known Martin for years, and despite his charm, something about him felt off. But she shook off the unease, too happy to be home to dwell on her brother's odd behavior. She grinned. "I missed you both. And this guy—" She turned and patted Zeus affectionately. "Did he behave himself?" "Absolutely. Martin replied smoothly. Zeus is a perfect gentleman. There was no trouble at all. He made sure to sound reassuring, but internally, a dark part of him reveled in the fact that he was getting away with it, that he had tricked them both so thoroughly. Ben clapped his hands together. Well, I'm sure it's been a long day for all of us. How about we all sit down, have a drink, and catch up? I can't wait to hear all the details of the honeymoon. Martin smiled, happy to play along with the innocent charade, but he had no intention of letting his guard down. Great idea, Ben, he said, ushering them both toward the living room. I'll get the drinks. You two settle in. As the evening wore on, Martin remained careful to keep his composure. He listened to Elena and Ben reminisce about their trip, laughing along with them, playing the role of the jovial host. But in the back of his mind, he couldn't help but feel the unease stirring. He had gotten so close. Just a little more time, and Ben would be the one to pay for his intrusion into Martin's life. But there was something else that gnawed at him. Something unexpected. Watching Elena and Ben so carefree, so oblivious to the danger lurking beneath the surface, made Martin feel something he hadn't expected: doubt. He knew that Zeus was capable of carrying out the plan, and yet the dogs returned to his loving self, the one that greeted Elena so eagerly, made Martin question whether he could truly control the situation. What if Zeus didn't react the way Martin intended? What if the bond between the dog and his owners was stronger than the conditioning Martin had imposed? What if he had underestimated the power of loyalty and love? That night, as Martin lay awake in his bed, he stared at the ceiling, troubled by thoughts that refused to be silenced. Outside his window, the sounds of the night seemed louder, more intrusive than ever before. The rustling of leaves in the trees, the distant hum of traffic, everything felt like a reminder of the life he was about to destroy. Elena and Ben were asleep upstairs, oblivious to the storm brewing below. And Zeus, now curled up on his bed by the fireplace, lay silent, his breathing slow and steady, unaware of the fate Martin had prepared for him and his family. But Martin's mind raced. He couldn't afford to falter now. There was too much at stake. His lifestyle, his comfort, everything he had come to expect. All of it was threatened by Ben's mere presence. He had to make sure that Zeus, the very creature they trusted, would do exactly what Martin had trained him for. As sleep finally claimed him, Martin muttered to himself, "They'll never know what hit them." He smiled, feeling the weight of his dark plans settle around him like a cloak. And so, with the newlyweds back under his roof, Martin waited, patiently, carefully, for the next chapter of his dangerous game to begin. The sun had barely risen over the horizon when Ben, suitcase in hand, stood by the front door of the Thompson estate, checking the time on his watch. He had always been a man of punctuality, and this morning was no different. His business trip to Los Angeles had been scheduled for weeks, but now, with everything packed and ready to go, he was already thinking about the work awaiting him on the other side of the country. "Elena," Ben called out, his voice echoing through the hallway. "I'm about to head out. You got everything you need while I'm gone." Elena appeared from the living room, a sleepy smile on her face as she made her way toward the front door. "You're really off already?" she asked, rubbing her eyes. "I can't believe you're leaving so early." Ben chuckled. I know. Early flight. It's all last minute. But you know how these things go." He leaned in to kiss her forehead. "Don't worry, I'll be back in a couple of days." "Well, be safe, and don't work too hard." Elena gave him a wink, her voice filled with playful concern. "And don't forget about Zeus. You know he'll miss you." Ben smiled, glancing at the dog, who was resting lazily by the door, looking up at him with those familiar, loyal eyes. "Of course, I'm not leaving him behind. He's coming with me. He'll keep me company in L.A. Zeus, as if he understood the significance of the moment, stood up and trotted over to Ben, tail wagging as he nuzzled his owner's legs. There was no sign of the aggression Martin had conditioned into the dog. To Ben, Zeus was still the same friendly companion he had always been. Exterior, On the inside, however, his heart was racing. This was it, the moment he'd been waiting for. The opportunity to strike Martin stood nearby, leaning against the doorway to the kitchen, watching the scene unfold with a calm, to finally rid himself of the one obstacle standing between him and his perfect life. With Ben leaving for a few days, Martin had the perfect window of time to execute his plan. "Hey, Ben," Martin called out, his voice smooth and nonchalant. "Need any help with the bags?" Ben shook his head, waving him off. "Nah, I've got it covered. Just trying to get Zeus settled in the car." Martin stepped closer, offering his help again. "Let me at least walk you out. I can keep an eye on Zeus while you get your stuff in the car." Ben considered it for a moment, then smiled, grateful for Martin's offer. "Thanks, man. That'd be great. I'll get the car started and bring the bags out in a second." As they walked down the long driveway together, Martin's thoughts raced. He had been planning for this moment for weeks. Zeus's behavior had been perfect, the training so precise that he couldn't have asked for a better outcome. Now, with Ben distracted and heading to Los Angeles, Martin knew he had an opportunity to manipulate everything to his advantage. "Everything set for your trip?" Martin asked, trying to sound casual, his voice light and conversational. "Yeah, it's a pretty standard business trip," Ben replied, opening the car door and tossing his suitcase into the trunk. "Just a couple of meetings, some clients to visit. It's a quick turnaround." Martin nodded, keeping his voice steady. "Sounds like a busy schedule." Ben closed the trunk and turned to Martin. "Well, you know how it is. Got to stay on top of things. But you won't mind keeping an eye on things here, right? It'll be nice to know that you and Zeus are here while I'm gone." "Oh, absolutely," Martin said, his smile never wavering. "You don't even have to ask. I'll keep Zeus company and make sure everything runs smoothly here. Just focus on your meetings. We'll be fine." Ben smiled, feeling reassured. He had always trusted Martin, and after all, he was family. "Thanks, Martin. You're a good brother-in-law." He patted Martin on the back before moving around to the driver's side of the car. "I'll be in touch. And keep Zeus out of trouble. I know he can be a handful." Martin chuckled, the sound smooth but hollow. "I've got it covered. Don't worry about him." As Ben slid into the car and started the engine, Martin watched him pull out of the driveway. He could feel his pulse quicken as he watched the car disappear down the road. Now, with Ben gone, the real work could begin. Inside the house, Martin moved with purpose. He had a plan to put into motion, and he knew exactly what had to be done. Zeus was the key to everything. And while the dog had been nothing more than an innocent participant in Martin's twisted scheme, the next few days were critical. He needed to ensure that Zeus would do his bidding when the time came. "All right, Zeus," Martin muttered to himself, turning his attention to the dog, who was lounging on the couch, completely unaware of the danger that was approaching. "You've been a good boy, but now it's time to finish what we started." Martin had spent weeks conditioning Zeus, teaching him to respond to certain triggers, and with Ben gone, there was no one left to stop him. He knew that Zeus had been trained well enough to follow his commands when needed, but now, Martin needed to solidify his control. Zeus lifted his head as Martin approached, his tail wagging lazily. The dog had no idea what was coming, no clue that everything he had been trained for was now leading to something far darker than he could imagine. "Sit, Zeus," Martin commanded firmly, his voice calm yet insistent. Zeus obediently sat down on the floor, looking up at Martin with wide, trusting eyes. "Good boy," Martin whispered, reaching into his pocket to pull out the small device he had used to control Zeus in the past. He pressed the button, just to remind the dog of what it felt like to be shocked. Zeus flinched slightly, but there was no immediate reaction, no sign of aggression. He had learned to associate the pain with the sound of the whistle and the relief that came afterward. But now, Martin needed to make sure the dog was fully prepared. He had no room for mistakes. Not now. He would have to keep Zeus in line, ready to do his bidding when the moment came. "I'll make sure you're ready," Martin whispered, a wicked grin playing at the corners of his mouth. With Ben out of the house for a few days, Martin knew that the time was ripe. He could feel the weight of the plan pressing on him, but he was ready. Zeus had been trained, and now all Martin had to do was wait for the right moment. And as the house fell silent once again, Martin's mind raced with the possibilities. The game was finally on, and he wasn't about to let anything or anyone stand in his way. The sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows across the empty stretch of highway as Martin drove through the early evening light. He gripped the steering wheel with a tight, anxious hand, his eyes flicking between the road and the rearview mirror, watching Ben's car in the distance. The time had finally come. Everything he had planned, all the weeks of conditioning and manipulation, led to this precise moment. Martin's mind raced with a mix of excitement and nervous energy. He had been following Ben's car for miles, keeping a careful distance to avoid detection. Ben, unsuspecting as always, cruised along with no idea that he was being trailed. The thought of how easily he could end it all, the luxurious life he had come to depend on, the years of resentment bottled up in his chest, made Martin's heart pound harder. This was the moment of reckoning. No second chances. One wrong move, and everything could fall apart. Ben had left town on business, and Martin had made sure to follow, waiting for the perfect opportunity to strike. He knew the highway well, having driven it countless times over the years. It was the perfect place for an ambush. Wide, deserted, with long stretches of road where he could execute his plan without interruption. Martin had anticipated that the traffic would be light, and he was right. There was barely another car in sight. His eyes scanned the horizon as he followed Ben's car, waiting for the ideal moment. The air was crisp as the wind whistled through the cracks of his slightly open window. The low hum of the engine was the only sound inside the car, the kind of silence that seemed too heavy for such a high-stakes mission. Martin glanced at the clock on his dashboard. It was just past 6 in the evening. Plenty of daylight left, but fading fast. He checked the rear view again. Ben's sedan was still in sight, just far enough ahead that Martin could keep a steady pace, but close enough to make his move. Martin had to make sure that nothing would go wrong. His plan was meticulous. There was only one shot at this, one chance to set everything in motion. Ahead, a bend in the road came into view. It was sharp, a place where any driver who wasn't paying attention could easily lose control. Martin's eyes narrowed as he saw the curve drawing nearer. He knew that this would be the spot. All the pieces had aligned. The road, the timing, the truck that was quickly approaching from the opposite direction. As he neared the bend, Martin pressed a button on the small device in his pocket. A faint click was all it took. The silent whistle, the one that had been hidden in the device for weeks, was ready. It emitted a high-pitched, inaudible sound, one that only dogs could hear. It was the key to the plan, the sound that had conditioned Zeus to associate with pain, discomfort, and aggression. Martin could almost feel the dog's distress, the anticipation of what was about to happen. Zeus would respond to the whistle immediately, and that's when it would all fall apart for Ben. "Here we go," Martin muttered to himself, gripping the wheel tighter as he focused on the road ahead. The truck that had been speeding toward them was just about to reach the curve. Perfect. There was no other car in sight, just the truck and Ben's car, isolated on the stretch of road, an easy target. Martin blew the whistle into the air, the sound cutting through the car like an invisible wave. A moment later, his eyes locked onto the rear-view mirror. He saw it before he heard it, the frantic thrashing of Zeus inside the car. The dog was reacting, as planned. Inside the sedan, Zeus began to whimper, his body jerking violently as the pain from the shock coursed through him. He had been conditioned to associate the high-pitched sound of the whistle with the electric shocks that followed, and the pain would trigger an uncontrollable response. Zeus was now completely out of control. Ben's car veered slightly as the sound reached Zeus's ears. His barking grew louder, more frantic, and before Ben could even react, Zeus went berserk. The Doberman slammed against the windows, his claws scraping the interior, his body shaking with rage and fear. Zeus let out a deep guttural growl. followed by a high-pitched howl that echoed through the car, sending a chill down Martin's spine. The dog was no longer the obedient companion that Ben knew. The dog was a weapon, trained and manipulated into a frenzy. "Ben!" Martin muttered under his breath, his pulse pounding as he watched the chaos unfold. Ben tried to regain control of the car, jerking the wheel to the left as Zeus went ballistic, barking and thrashing. Ben's knuckles turned white as he gripped the wheel, but Zeus's frenzied behavior was too much for him to handle. The car swerved, tires screeching against the asphalt as the powerful dog slammed against the windows. Zeus was no longer a pet. He was a force of destruction. Martin's heart raced as he saw Ben's face twist in confusion and fear, his eyes darting to the back seat, trying to calm the dog. But it was too late. The road was curving sharply, and Ben's hands were off the wheel for just a moment, distracted by the chaos in the back seat. And that was all it took. With a deafening screech of tires, the car lost its grip on the road. It fishtailed violently, and then, in the blink of an eye, the vehicle was thrown into a spin. Martin saw the headlights flicker wildly, the car skidding toward the edge of the highway. "Come on, Ben. Stay in control," Martin muttered to himself, but he knew it was over. There was nothing Ben could do now. The truck that had been speeding toward them was right there, close enough to make the impact inevitable. Ben's car slid, tires screeching, the momentum too much to fight. The truck's horn blared in warning, but it was far too late. In an instant, the two vehicles collided with a violent crash. Martin slammed on the brakes, bringing his own car to a halt several yards away from the wreck. His breath was shallow as he watched the aftermath unfold in his rearview mirror. Ben's car, now crumpled and twisted, sat in the middle of the road, the front end smashed in from the impact. For a moment, everything was silent. The road, the scene, the world, it all seemed to freeze in time. Then, as Martin turned off his engine, he stepped out of the car, taking a deep breath. His eyes remained locked on the wreckage as a twisted satisfaction coursed through him. He had done it. Ben was out of the picture, just as he had planned. Martin glanced back at his own car, where Zeus, the now unrecognizable Doberman, sat panting and whimpering, his eyes wide with confusion. The dog had done his part, and now, so had Martin. All that remained was to make sure the pieces stayed in place. The sharp bend in the road had come too quickly, and Ben had no time to react. Zeus was completely out of control, his body thrashing against the back seat, his claws digging into the upholstery as he barked violently. The Doberman's howls filled the car, drowning out everything else, even the roar of the wind rushing past them. Ben's grip on the steering wheel tightened as he tried to regain control of the vehicle, but it was no use. The frantic dog had taken over the car, and Ben could do nothing but try to survive the chaos that had ensued. "Zeus, calm down, boy. It's okay," Ben shouted desperately, his voice breaking. He glanced in the rear-view mirror, eyes wide in disbelief at the dog's erratic behavior. Zeus's eyes were wild, his body thrumming with energy as he barked uncontrollably, flinging himself from side to side in a futile attempt to escape the pain that Martin had meticulously inflicted on him. Ben's heart raced as the car veered dangerously close to the edge of the road. His knuckles turned white from gripping the wheel, but no matter how hard he tried, the car wouldn't respond. The wheels squealed as the tires skidded on the slick asphalt, and for a moment it felt like time slowed down. Ben's mind raced. He was trying to keep the car straight, trying to keep it from flipping, but his vision was clouded with panic. Zeus's sudden violent behavior had thrown him completely off course. In the mirror, Ben could see the oncoming truck speeding towards him, its massive headlights cutting through the gloom of the evening. The truck's horn blared loudly, warning Ben that it was too late. A split second before impact, Ben's hand slipped off the wheel, momentarily distracted by Zeus, who slammed against the side window with a final, desperate bark. The crash was inevitable. With a horrific screech of metal, the two vehicles collided with a violent thud. The sound of the impact reverberated through the night, a cacophony of twisted metal and shattering glass. Ben's car was sent spinning, its front end crumpling like paper as the truck plowed into it head-on. The force of the crash sent the truck itself skidding sideways, its massive wheels leaving deep tire marks in the road as it veered off course. Inside Ben's car, everything went black in an instant. The moment the crash occurred, everything went quiet. The loud screeching of the tires, the crunch of metal. Suddenly, it all stopped. The car's wreckage sat there, motionless, surrounded by the scattering debris of the crash. The headlights of the truck flickered out, leaving a haunting darkness to envelop the wreck. Martin, who had been following from a distance, watched the entire scene unfold in his rearview mirror. He didn't flinch. He didn't even feel a stir of emotion. His heart didn't race. No! Martin had planned for this moment too carefully. The outcome was exactly as he had anticipated. As the dust settled, Martin took a slow, measured breath. He knew this was his moment, his escape. Without a hint of panic, he made a sharp turn off the highway and into the small thicket of trees just off the road. There, hidden from view, he parked his car and sat in silence for a moment, watching as a glow of emergency lights began to flicker in the distance. Sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder with each passing second. Martin's mind remained clear and sharp. He knew what he had to do. His plan had been executed perfectly. No one would connect him to the accident. After all, who would suspect a man of such meticulous planning? In the aftermath of the crash, there would be nothing linking him to the scene. No witnesses, no evidence. Just a tragic accident that would be blamed on the dog's sudden aggression. Zeus had been conditioned to act violently at the exact moment needed, right when Ben was vulnerable. The truck driver had been an unfortunate casualty of the chaos, but his death would be chalked up to the unpredictable nature of highway accidents. The thought of Ben lying dead in the wreckage didn't faze Martin. Ben had always been a threat to his comfortable life. He had taken control of Elena's finances, and now he had to be removed. And now, with the accident complete, Martin's life would return to normal. The luxurious lifestyle he had come to expect would be his once again. From his hiding spot, Martin could see the flashing lights of police cars and ambulances approaching. He smiled coldly to himself. They would find Ben's body, along with the body of the truck driver. There would be no question of what had happened. The police would write it up as a tragic collision, an accident caused by a man who had lost control of his vehicle. And Zeus, the dog, would be blamed for his violent behavior. They would probably even put him down. Everything is in place, Martin whispered to himself as he adjusted his rear-view mirror, making sure no one had seen him. He remained parked in the bushes, taking note of the officers arriving at the scene. His heart remained calm, even as the chaos unfolded just a short distance away. The police would do their job. Of course, they would. They would look at the wreckage and investigate. But Martin knew they wouldn't find any answers that pointed to him. As the first responders rushed to the wreckage, Martin pulled the collar of his jacket higher, shielding his face from any prying eyes. He could hear the faint sounds of the sirens as they approached the scene, but they were a world away from where he sat. He smiled, leaning back in his seat. The hard part was over. The rest would be easy. No one knew about his involvement in the accident. No one knew about the sinister role he had played in bringing about Ben's death. And as long as he kept his distance, kept his cool, no one ever would. "I did it," Martin muttered softly to himself, savoring the moment. The life he had carefully built, the life he had desperately clung to for so long, was now his again. There was nothing to stand in his way. The sirens continued to wail, growing fainter as the investigation began. But Martin knew it was just a matter of time before the whole thing was swept under the rug. Another tragic accident, another life lost to fate. The crash had been perfect. Martin had watched from a safe distance as the wreckage unfolded, confident that his plan had gone off without a hitch. The violent collision between Ben's car and the oncoming truck was everything he had hoped for, sudden, chaotic, and utterly tragic. The emergency response vehicles were already on their way, and by the time the authorities arrived, the scene would speak for itself. Zeus would be blamed for the chaos. It was all falling into place. But just as Martin was about to turn the key in the ignition and drive away, he froze. His breath caught in his throat. From the wreckage, a shape emerged, a silhouette limping through the smoke and debris. It was Zeus. The dog had survived. Martin's eyes widened as the Doberman staggered out from the twisted remains of the car. He was limping, his fur matted with blood and dirt, but there he was, alive. His heavy breathing echoed in the eerie silence of the highway. His fur bristled with a wild, unkempt energy, as though he was still caught in the aftermath of the chaos he had just experienced. Zeus's head turned toward Martin. For a moment the dog paused, as if processing the situation. Then, as if drawn by some invisible force, he began to move toward him, limping through the wreckage with a single-minded determination. Martin's heart raced. A sickening knot twisted in his stomach. No, this couldn't be happening. The dog had been supposed to be a tool, a weapon to carry out his twisted plan. But now Zeus, the very creature he had conditioned to kill, was alive, and worse, he was coming directly toward him. Zeus! No! Martin hissed under his breath, trying to stay calm as he gripped the steering wheel tightly. His mind raced, calculating every possible outcome. The dog, bloodied and broken, was still coming. He could feel the tension mounting with every agonizing step Zeus took toward him. His breath was coming faster now, his limbs feeling heavier by the second. Zeus's eyes locked onto Martin, and in that moment, the dog's expression seemed almost affectionate. The aggressive, frenzied behavior Martin had worked so hard to cultivate was nowhere to be seen. Instead, Zeus's movements were slow, deliberate, as though the dog was simply seeking comfort after the horror he had endured. And worse, as the dog grew closer, Martin realized what it was. The dog wasn't approaching him with hostility. No! Zeus recognized him. Zeus had been conditioned to associate the pain of the shocks with Martin's presence. The person who had alleviated that pain, the one who had given him the food, the treats, the comfort. Martin had become his savior, his protector in a world of agony. Zeus limped closer, his head low, his eyes filled with confusion, but there was no doubt. He was looking for his savior, the person who had always been there to ease his suffering. No! Martin whispered to himself. This can't be happening. Not now. As Zeus came closer, Martin's eyes darted around, searching for an escape. He could hear the faint sound of sirens in the distance, the rush of emergency vehicles heading toward the wreckage. He couldn't afford to be seen with the dog. He couldn't let the authorities question why Zeus, of all dogs, was so fixated on him. If they saw the dog following him, it would raise questions. They'd wonder why the dog, after everything that had happened, was so determined to follow this particular man. Martin's mind raced. There was no time to think about anything else. His heart pounded in his chest. He needed to lose the dog. Now. Get away from me, he hissed under his breath, panic creeping into his voice. But Zeus didn't respond to the command. He was too far gone, too conditioned, too lost in the cycle of his trust in Martin. The dog was only a few steps away now, limping toward him with an air of sadness, as though he was looking for some comfort from the one person he had learned to depend on. Martin's hands shook as he reached for the door handle. I'll lose him in the forest, he muttered desperately, his mind scrambling for a solution. I'll lead him out of here, and they won't find us. We'll get away. He threw open the door and quickly stepped out of the car, his eyes scanning the trees along the edge of the road. The woods. He could lose Zeus there, if he acted fast enough. He could disappear into the darkness, and the dog wouldn't be able to follow him. It was his only chance. Come on, Zeus. Come on, boy, Martin whispered, trying to sound calm as he stepped away from the wreckage. He began to jog slowly toward the woods, hoping the dog would follow. If he could just make it into the trees, Martin would be safe. The authorities wouldn't connect him to the wreck. He could vanish into the night. But Zeus didn't hesitate. The dog's limp had slowed him down, but his determination had not waned. Zeus followed, his eyes locked on Martin, unwilling to be left behind. The dog's soft whimpers echoed in the quiet night as he trudged behind him, still fixated on Martin, as though the human was his only link to safety. Martin's pulse quickened. The sound of Zeus's heavy footsteps behind him was like a ticking clock, growing louder with every step. The farther he went into the woods, the harder it would be to shake Zeus off. And the harder it became, the more Martin realized Zeus wasn't going to leave him. "Why won't you just leave me alone?" Martin muttered, panic creeping into his voice. "I saved you. I gave you food. I gave you everything. Why won't you just stay back?" But Zeus only continued, his limp now a steady rhythm as he followed Martin through the woods. There was no escaping the dog. The bond Martin had created with him was too strong, and it was far too late for any form of undoing. As Martin dashed deeper into the forest, he realized, with a sickening feeling in his gut, that his plan was slipping out of his control. The very creature he had tried to manipulate and use for his own gain was now the one thing that could ruin everything. The bond between them had been forged in pain and manipulation, and now it was his undoing. The air was thick with sorrow as the mourners gathered around Ben's grave. The sky was overcast, heavy clouds hanging low, as if the heavens themselves were mourning the tragic loss of the man who had been taken so suddenly. Ben's family, friends, and colleagues stood in somber silence, their faces pale and hollow with grief. Martin stood among them, his face the perfect picture of sorrow, his hand gently resting on his sister Elena's shoulder. "Elena," Martin whispered softly, pretending to choke on his words. "I know this is so hard. I can't believe he's gone. He was a good man. You were so lucky to have him." Elena, still wearing her black veil, wept quietly, her sobs breaking through the otherwise silent mourning. "How could this have happened, Martin?" she whispered through her tears, clutching his arm tightly. "Ben, he was everything to me." Martin's voice trembled, not from sorrow but from the sheer amount of control it took to keep his face composed. "I know, Elena, I know, but he's in a better place now. We'll get through this together." His words were empty, rehearsed, and filled with a kind of artificial sorrow. Every word was meant to manipulate, to keep up the charade that Martin had nothing to do with Ben's death. The funeral was a stage, and the audience, Elena, the family, the mourners, would never know what had really happened. They would never suspect that the man standing beside her, comforting her, was the one who had orchestrated Ben's demise. As the priest began the solemn prayers, Martin stood stiffly, his eyes shifting occasionally toward the open grave. He had seen many funerals, but this one felt different. This was his final victory, the culmination of his twisted plan to rid himself of the obstacle that was Ben. But there was something more here, something almost surreal. As the casket was lowered into the earth, Martin felt a strange chill in the air. For the briefest moment, a fleeting doubt passed through his mind, but it was quickly replaced by the satisfaction of what he had done. The mourners began to scatter, some quietly talking among themselves, others wiping away tears. Elena remained standing by the grave, staring down at the coffin. Martin reached over to comfort her once again, placing his hand on her back. But his attention was elsewhere. There, just to the side of the grave, was Zeus. The dog was still traumatized from the accident, and his eyes were wide, confused. He had been brought to the funeral by one of the family members, though no one seemed to pay much attention to the animal. Zeus was standing motionless, his body rigid, his tail tucked between his legs. He looked lost, caught in some bizarre place between understanding and confusion. It was then, in that moment of eerie silence, that the faint sound of a jet flying overhead pierced the air. It was barely audible, the high-pitched whine of the jet engines cutting through the stillness like a distant scream. Zeus's ears perked up, his head jerking upward at the sound. His nostrils flared. The noise, a noise that had once triggered his worst memories, the sounds of pain and the cruel shocks from Martin's electric collar, sent a ripple of panic through the dog. His instincts took over. Without warning, Zeus let out a loud, desperate bark, his body tense, his posture defensive. The dog began to pace back and forth in agitation, his barking growing more frantic with each passing second. "Zeus! Stop!" Elena cried, trying to get the dog under control, but it was too late. The dog's behavior became erratic. The memories of his conditioning, the pain, the fear, were surfacing in an uncontrollable wave of panic. His frantic barking turned to growls, and his movements became more erratic. Then, as if caught in a whirlwind of confusion and terror, Zeus lunged forward. In a moment of blind, frenzied terror, Zeus darted toward Martin, his body crashing into him with a force that was too sudden to react to. The mourners looked on in confusion, unable to comprehend the chaos unfolding before them. "Zeus! No!" Martin shouted, his arms flailing as he tried to steady himself. But the force of the dog's impact was too much. Zeus knocked Martin off balance, sending him stumbling toward the edge of the open grave. Martin's feet slid on the loose dirt, his body tipping over the edge. "No!" he screamed in panic, but it was too late. The fall was swift. In a matter of seconds, Martin's body had dropped into the grave below, his head striking the dirt with a sickening crack. The crowd gasped, their shock evident in the collective intake of breath. The suddenness of the event left them frozen in disbelief. Martin, the man who had been so comforting just moments before, was now lying motionless in the grave. His body was contorted, his neck twisted at an unnatural angle. The life had been knocked out of him in an instant, his final breath lost to the dark soil of the grave. "Elena!" someone cried, rushing to her side as she collapsed in shock, her hand flying to her mouth in disbelief. But Elena could barely comprehend what had just happened. Her focus was on the figure of Zeus, who had stopped barking, now sitting motionless at the edge of the grave, his eyes wide with confusion. The dog's chest rose and fell rapidly, his body trembling. What happened?" Elena whispered, her voice cracking with horror as she looked down at her brother's lifeless body. Martin, the mourners, too, were frozen in shock. They had no idea what had just transpired. The dog had startled them all, but no one could explain the chain of events. They had been so focused on the tragedy of Ben's passing that they hadn't noticed the signs of something more sinister. Zeus, his frantic barking now silenced, seemed to sense that something was wrong. He watched as the family and the others gathered around the edge of the grave, their attention now on the tragic fall of Martin. The dog's confusion only deepened. He was left with no one to turn to, no comfort to be found. In the days that followed, the incident would be discussed in hushed tones. The mourners would wonder how Martin had ended up in the grave, his death so sudden, so inexplicable. They would never know the twisted web of manipulation, betrayal, and deceit that had led to this tragic end. They would never understand the full extent of what had really happened. But one thing would always remain. The death of Martin, the man who had orchestrated so much pain, had come at the hands of the one creature he had betrayed the most. And in that tragic fall, he had paid the price. The wind swept through the graveyard, rustling the leaves of the trees that stood like silent sentinels over the fresh graves. The crowd had slowly dissipated, leaving behind a heavy silence that seemed to linger, almost as if the earth itself was unwilling to release the weight of the tragedy that had unfolded. Zeus stood motionless by the grave, his eyes fixed on the two freshly dug holes. He tilted his head slightly, ears twitching as he looked first at the grave of Ben, and then back at Martin's fallen body, still lying at the bottom of the open grave. The dog's confusion was palpable, his once fierce and loyal nature now reduced to a broken shell of the creature he had been. He had been Martin's weapon, the tool that had been manipulated and conditioned to fulfill a deadly purpose. But now, with both Ben and Martin gone, Zeus was left alone, with no one to turn to, no master to serve. Elena stood at the edge of the grave, her face pale and streaked with tears. She had been devastated by the loss of her husband, but the shock of losing her brother in such a strange and violent manner was almost too much to bear. Her eyes flickered from Martin's lifeless body to Zeus, who was still standing eerily by the graveside, lost and bewildered. "Zeus, what happened?" Elena whispered, her voice trembling as she called out to the dog, but there was no answer. The dog seemed to hear her, his head turning toward her for a brief moment, but his eyes lacked any real recognition. He was no longer the same animal who had once responded to her voice with eager affection. The link between them had been severed, and in its place was only the silence of betrayal and confusion. A bitter chill seemed to settle in the air as Elena looked down at Martin's body, unable to comprehend what had just occurred. It was as though the world had turned upside down. She had never imagined that Martin, her brother, the one who had always been by her side, would be the architect of such pain and destruction. But now, standing here, she couldn't deny the truth. The horrifying realization hit her like a wave. She had been blind to his actions for so long, too trusting, too caught up in her own grief to see what was happening right in front of her. But what was truly chilling, more than her brother's death, was the haunting fact that Martin's demise had been caused by the very method he had used to manipulate Zeus into killing Ben. The silent whistle, the instrument of control, had turned against him. It had been his weapon of choice, his tool for orchestrating the end of Ben's life, but it had sealed Martin's fate just as surely as it had orchestrated Ben's death. The whistle's high-pitched, inaudible sound had driven Zeus into a frenzy, and in his blind panic, the dog had unintentionally hurled Martin into the grave, breaking his neck in the process. Martin, in his twisted pursuit of power and control, had never anticipated that the very forces he sought to command would turn against him. How did it come to this? Elena muttered, her voice barely above a whisper, as she watched Zeus slowly step away from the edge of the grave. She took a step forward, her body trembling as she approached the dog. He was no longer the powerful Doberman he had once been, no longer the weapon her brother had manipulated. He was, in this moment, just a scared animal, a victim of Martin's cruelty. Zeus looked up at her, his eyes full of confusion, as if searching for the comfort and safety he once found in her presence. As Elena knelt down beside him, she realized the depths of the tragedy. She had lost her husband, the man she loved, and now she had lost her brother as well, all because of a man driven by greed and power. And in the end, the dog, the creature Martin had used and abused, was left standing as a symbol of innocence in the midst of the wreckage Martin had left behind. The irony wasn't lost on Elena. Martin's need for control, his need to dominate and manipulate, had destroyed everything. His plan to secure his life had backfired in the most tragic way. He had used Zeus to exact his revenge, but it was Zeus who ultimately brought his own death. In the end, Martin had only succeeded in trapping himself in the very web of deceit he had woven. Elena stood up, wiping the last of the tears from her eyes. The mourners had long since left, and the world around her seemed to stand still, as if holding its breath. She knew that life would never be the same again. The house that had once been filled with laughter and love now stood as a cold, empty reminder of everything that had been lost. Her brother's betrayal, her husband's death, and the twisted fate of Zeus were all intertwined in a way that left her reeling. She didn't know how to move on from this. How could anyone? Zeus, sensing the shift in the atmosphere, walked slowly toward the gate of the cemetery. He didn't look back. He had no master to follow, no purpose to fulfill. For the first time in his life, Zeus was free.